This is Power 98.7. And now you're listening to Power Talk with Mbuyiseni Ndlozi, 9 a.m. to midday, taking your calls on 0861 987 000.
Welcome back indeed. Thanks very much, Zulibanzi, for that bulletin. We're going to, as I indicated earlier, speak to this question of the wealth tax. And we are joined on the line by Thokozile Madonko. Welcome to Power Talk, Togo.
Good morning, and good morning to your listeners.
Thanks indeed for joining us and creating time. Togo is a political economist and researcher at Southern Center for Inequality at Wits University. Is that correct, Togo?
That's correct.
And we're also joined by Lance Collop, Chartered Accountant and Tax Advisor from Collop Tax Collective. Welcome to Power Talk, and thanks very much for creating time, Lance.
Good morning. Good morning to you and the listeners, and thank you for having me.
Thank you. I'm going to start with the basic question for the benefit of everyone. Just, Tax 101. Thokozile, what is wealth tax, and what are the different forms, or in what way does it differ from, for instance, personal income tax, and how has it been implemented before? Maybe you could give examples from other countries as well.
Yeah, perfect. So a wealth tax is a tax based on the total value of a person's assets. So we're talking about their properties, their yachts, their paintings, anything that they have that forms part of their wealth. And that's what makes it different from a personal income tax, which is a tax on your income, so on your salary that you get every month from your employer. And so it's important to note that we're really talking about the super rich here, because most of us would like to think of ourselves as wealthy. And given the levels of inequality in South Africa, many of us, we have such a huge proportion of the South African population that are not wealthy, and so do not fall under this category of wealth taxes. And I wouldn't even fall into the category of the super wealthy, because we're talking about multi-million rand individuals.
Yeah. Are you able to give a specific figure? What is to be super wealthy in South Africa today?
So that's a political question. So the research that we've done, we've kind of started the threshold at around having a kind of tax burden or wealth tax of around 3.5 million. So that's kind of the 35,000 South Africans earn that threshold. But that's a political question to decide whether we start there or we start at the 99.9%, which is 3,500 people approximately with a threshold of 118 or 119 million. An average before tax of 393 million. So we're talking big amounts of money. So to be able to say, where we want to tax, at what point we tax, that becomes a political question that should be decided through Parliament, in fact, through the way in which we decide on our tax rate for a wealth tax. But we are talking about the super wealthy here, not your average South African who's struggling with debt, trying to pay their mortgage, trying to pay off their car. We're not talking about that group of individuals.
Yeah. We're talking about wealthy people. Okay, Lance, I just want us to spend a little bit more time on the definitional aspects of it and the sort of comparisons across the world before we zoom into South Africa. I don't know if, Lance, you want to add to that aspect of the conversation at a definitional level.
Yes, I guess, there's not much more to add other than to note that it is an entirely theoretical discussion right now. There's been nothing tabled as to how that would look. And maybe just to reiterate that we do have existing forms of a wealth tax in the form of particularly estate duty and transfer duty. I think estate duty in particular is a tax that is very unique to South Africa. And there might be one or two, other countries in the world. And similarly, there are a handful of countries, to my knowledge, that that impose a wealth tax, and there are reasons for the of countries that do so.
Yeah.
But agree. I mean, the mechanics of it and who it will apply to are very much up in the air. I mean, a wealthy person in South Africa, who, to my mind, earns, is employed, arguably, or earns 10,000, 20,000 rand a month, you could argue. So that becomes a big debate, but I won't go into that.
Okay, we will. I mean, I think maybe I keep pushing you guys, but let's take the sort of other countries that have done this. What comes to my mind, for instance, Norway, Switzerland, France have implemented a wealth tax. Can any of you speak to us about how it works in any of these countries? Togo?
Yes. So the most important thing is that you're looking at the assets of the super rich, and we're looking at their what is referred to in the lingo as their effective tax rate. So often what happens is if you just look at personal income tax, the top 1% of earners often pay a lower effective tax rate, which is essentially the percentage of the percentage of their income. So relative to income, pay a much lower rate than the rest of us, who, as a percentage of our income, pay higher rates. So in South Africa, it can be about 32 to 40%, right? Whereas for the super wealthy, it could be anywhere between 0.0% of their income. So a billionaire should never pay a lower percentage of income tax than a secretary or cleaner. But that then enables them to also generate wealth. And so this is why countries like France and Sweden and so forth have said that we need to look at the full picture of this individual, not just their income. We need to look at their assets. And so we look at, so how they've done it is by looking at their entire asset pool in terms of their yachts that they own, the paintings. As I said, it can be a number of different things. And then they decide on what kind of tax, what percentage of that their assets they will then pay, which can be like a 0.01%. So the research that we've done, the center has done, has looked at, sort of rates of 0.1%. On assets that would generate much needed revenue to the fiscus. So, and also it's important to note that it's not just about accessing these funds from the super wealthy. It's also a tool to reduce extreme inequality, and this is often not talked about in the debate. So the minister, when he talked about saying, oh, these rich people are going to flee, they're not going to pay, they're going to run away. Well, it's very hard to flee with your multi-million rand mansion, right? So many of these wealthy individuals are tied to the countries that they live in. So even that's a bit of a myth that they're going to run away. The issue of not paying tax is a legitimate one because wealthy people tend to try and avoid paying tax. But that isn't a reason to then not tax them. So that's why we need a strong South African revenue service that can catch them and make sure that we don't have tax avoidance and evasion and illicit financial flows of resources. So it's not good enough to have the rich people tell us, well, we won't pay tax, don't tax us because we won't pay the tax. No, we will litigate you and make you pay the tax. The third area is about the extreme inequality in this country. Some argue that we have obscene levels of inequality. And this has meant that wealth inequality in South Africa has not declined since 1994, and in fact has increased after the 2008 financial crisis. And so our wealth inequality is much higher than France, the United Kingdom, the United States, China, Russia, India, for example. And that destabilizes your democracy and destabilizes the progressive realization.
And how does the wealth tax resolve that?
It does so by redistributing resources, because essentially a billionaire doesn't need all those billions. It's good. Diminishing returns is a key aspect. There's only so much a human being can spend in a day, in a month, in a year. And so we want to redistribute those resources because we have over 14 million South Africans, for example, that do not have the 27 rand a day needed.
So when you have collected,
we need to redistribute this wealth.
Yeah, address us before I bring in Lance. This redistribution mechanism. When you've got, let's say you do collect a 0.1%, whatever percentage, on a predetermined group of wealthy people in South Africa, how do you hope? Because it is the state that collects it, how do you hope it will be distributed such that it addresses inequalities?
So this is the biggest question, right, that is often raised around taxation. It's about people's trust in government's ability to deliver. But it's a chicken and egg question, because if you have a state that doesn't have the resources to deliver, then it's not delivering. But if you give it the resources, it might have a better opportunity to deliver those services. And so that's why we need to think about strengthening our oversight institutions.
So what is the revenue problem? Maybe just as a last question, what is the revenue in real sort of, even if in percentile terms, what is the revenue problem that, wealth tax is trying to address in your determination?
So I would actually not say the revenue problem. I would say what is the delivery need problem. So it is a question of shifting, and this has been part of my critique of the debate so far around the budget, is that we haven't talked about what is the need that the budget needs to deliver on. And that is on delivering on unemployment, inequality, poverty, gender-based violence, making sure our kids don't have pit latrine toilets. That's the need. And so that's the gap that we need our resources to fill. And we haven't done adequate costing of our budgets in the last, I would say, since 2012, as to whether we have a budget that is being designed based on need to deliver on the services that are required by South Africans.
Okay. So the revenue need, isn't it tax, it's revenue collection. I'm going to give you another time to bite on this. What is the revenue gap that you think the tax called wealth tax is going to close?
So it's going to contribute to the fiscus in a whole. So that's why I'm saying it's quite hard to answer your question, because it's not the rand value for me is determined once we know what the need is. So how many teachers do we need in our system? How many nurses? How many doctors? How do we need to make sure that...
Please think about it, Togo, because isn't it that's the basis upon which you then make a case that we've got this revenue hole and in order to do 1, 2, 3, 4, maybe as a point of departure. And maybe the problem of tax to GDP, debt to GDP ratio, maybe the problem of, as you indicate, we need to increase social grants or whatever the case. What is it? Why do we need wealth tax in South Africa? Is so as to government can collect money to achieve what? That's my essential question, that it is unable to achieve with its current tax regime.
So essentially what I would argue is that we have a fiscal policy that is not designed for delivering on the needs. So our gap is one that hasn't actually been quantified by the government, because they have decided to prioritize debt repayments, which is necessary, but we don't know the real gap because they have limited the amount of the fiscal framework has been limited over time.
But would you agree you have to answer that question before you could say that there needs to be a wealth tax? Am I missing something?
No. So the way I would answer it to you is that two things. One, we need to deal with inequality, and wealth taxes enable you to redistribute resources. So that's one of the fundamental aspects of it, as a tool for redistribution and dealing with inequality and poverty. The second aspect is that it's there to then, as part of our tax mix, like you've said, our revenue policy, so it's our entire revenue policy, that then says given the needs in our society, what we need to do. We need to build houses. We need to make sure our electricity, our lights are on. What does that cost? And then how do we then determine how much of the tax mix we will then use wealth taxes, personal income tax, corporate income tax? Because the reality is we've actually decreased taxes on personal income tax on the ultra wealthy. We've actually decreased corporate income tax from 28% to 27%. And we're now relying on value-added tax to fill that gap. But that's a crisis made by Treasury. And it doesn't tell us what the need is, because they're reducing the size of the pie, so to speak.
Yeah.
So we need a bigger pie.
Okay. Lance, I know that you stand on the direct opposite of this proposal. What do you have to say to the substantial argument Togo has put? Is there a need for a wealth tax in South Africa?
I think as a starting point, I'm certainly not against a wealth tax,
Okay.
and I think it's important to note that our current system of tax is in fact a wealth tax in the sense that it's progressive. So the more you earn, the more tax you pay. Essentially, so a wealth tax is merely an extension of what is already the tax framework. I think it's a question of timing. And the practicality of it. And this is all very good in theory. But do we know for sure that every person who owns assets of, let's say, over 10 million rand is already paying his fair share of tax or her fair share of tax? Now, if that is not the case, and all we now want to do is impose a wealth tax on the people who are quite complicit. Is that fair? So when the commissioner says we need to capacitate SARS to enforce the tax legislation, that has to be where we start. A wealth tax is simply an easy way out. And possibly, killing the goose that lays the golden egg. Once we have the tax laws properly, because, I know, if you see someone driving a Ferrari and has that person been audited? It's a really simple thing to do and get to a point where you now have a wider tax base, and then you may need to sit back and say, well, do we still need a wealth tax? That's the one issue. The other issue is, these are all linked to, I guess, data available to SARS.
Yeah.
A lot of the wealthy will have wealth offshore. Do we know? Can we know? Will we ever know? A lot of the wealthy have assets in trust structures, where we've only now started to ask for information around who the beneficiaries are, the ultimate beneficial owners of those assets. Where are they? How are we going to tax those assets? So, to me, it's a very risky approach. You could say, well, we're going to collect X amount more in revenue over the next year, but at what long-term cost? To me, it's more cautious. We should capacitate SARS to ensure that everybody pays his or her fair share before we start.
But Lance, in what way? Maybe just before we go to the news, can you just break down the statement you made earlier that our tax system already, in the manner of being progressive, already is a wealth tax? Can you break that down for us? In what way is it already a wealth tax if this is in relation, for instance, to what Togo said earlier, that billionaires pay less than sort of the middle class?
It's a good statement, but if we have what progressivity means is the more you earn, the more tax you pay. Now that's linked to income. That's not linked to assets. So that it is different in that regard. So someone who earns, let's say 10,000 Rand a month, is going to pay tax at a lower rate of tax than someone who earns 100,000 Rand per month. In fact, I think someone who earns 10,000 is below the threshold. So let's take 20,000.
Yeah.
You pay 18% on, let's say, 5,000 of that. So then you pay, let's say, 1,000 Rand in tax. Whereas someone who's earning 100,000 Rand a month would be paying, something like 20 or 25,000 Rand a month of your 100,000 in taxes. So that's what progressivity means. And this is where the issue with VAT comes in, is that VAT is regressive in the sense that everybody pays 15% or 15%, I think, regardless of what you earn.
And in that sense, it covers the wealth tax, despite the fact that assets are not included, because this is a different other aspect, that there is a whole lot of wealth in the hands of these people other than their salaries or income, as it were, whether it be in dividends or whatever.
So the wealth tax is different, but my point I'm making is that when we look at the personal income tax collections, and particularly we're looking at those persons who should be paying tax at 45%. How many people are there? How many tax are out there that SARS doesn't have on the system?
Okay.
Make sure we tax in everyone, before we tax the people that are actually complicit.
Okay, let me take the headlines and we'll continue. Please, both of you, if you could hold. It's 10:30 here on Power Talk with me, Mbuyiseni Ndlozi. We're going to take the headlines with Zwelibanzi Mazibuko. We also welcome your calls and contribution on 0861 987 000. If you want to join the conversation, please do give us your opinion and call us on what do you think about this matter of the wealth tax. Headlines with Zwelibanzi Mazibuko.
Power Talk with Mbuyiseni Ndlozi, where your voice is heard and opinion matters.
0861987000. Talk to us. We're having a conversation on the wealth tax. Do you think the wealth tax can work in South Africa? Thokozile, you were still. I hope you would have listened to Lance's input there about already the situation we have in South Africa is one of a progressive taxing of the wealthy. The higher you are, the more tax you pay. But you seem to make a different point earlier. What do you have to say now?
So the progressivity tax mix has shifted over time, and so it's important for us to see how much we depended on in the past. In the 60s, 70s, 80s, we can go back on corporate income tax versus value-added tax versus personal income tax, right? And so that has shifted over time, and we have moved away from corporate income tax and personal income tax as the bulwark of our tax mix into depending on value-added tax more and more, and other kinds of sin taxes and so forth, which are important because we need them. And so it's important for us to recognize that tax is a political game. And it's a political game that you have to keep your eye on, because you can get caught up in the percentages and the language. It gets a bit confusing. So what the colleagues from the Alternative Information Development Center have said when they looked at, now we're not talking about a wealth tax here, we're talking about personal income tax, so just people's income in terms of their salaries and so forth, is that over time, in the last 30 years, we've actually reduced our top-end rate. So wealthier people now, today, in 2025, pay a lower percentage of their effective tax rate is lower than it was in 1994. So wealthy people have really done well in the way in which we've shifted and changed.
Can you give that in numbers, just so that Lance does not ask the same question, because I want to get back to him specifically on this point. In what way have the wealthy in South Africa paid less tax relatively?
So in 2027, for example...
Sorry, in 20?
In 2017.
Yeah.
I'm just looking at a document.
2017.
Here.
Okay.
Yeah. It was. Sorry. It was. Not giving it to me now. Sorry. I've just shifted my tables. I can't see it. I'll have to look for it for you here.
Okay.
Oh, here we go. No, this is not by year. Sorry, I can't find it now. But essentially, the most important thing is to look at what has happened to the top end of taxpayers. And even then, the most important thing is that we're not even getting to all the, like my colleague said earlier, is that we're not actually getting to all the taxpayers in terms of personal income tax before we even talk about a wealth tax. We're not making sure that we are capturing all of those.
But isn't it that is Lance's point? Lance's point
Exactly.
is your current tax regime is perfect. It does need to be strengthened because it's firstly progressive. The wealthier you earn, the more you get taxed. Secondly, let us ensure that we get into a proper assessment of everyone's incomes and we are able to tax everybody as we should and close those illicit financial flows which are leakages to the tax revenue. His point is you don't need an additional sort of tax category. You're already taxing the rich.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean,
yeah. So the nice thing is that you challenged me a little bit earlier around saying what is the gap? What would be the gap? And I've been thinking in the break of, would it be our debt repayments, for example? That's the gap, because we're losing that money to the fiscus. So that could be a figure. I then looked at some research that threw around that in the changes that have happened to personal income tax that the Alternative Information Development Center has done. So I can't give you the change from year to year because I can't pull up the table. But essentially what they've said is over this period of time that they have forfeited over 198 billion every year, which is about 160% of the police budget or about 73% of the health budget. So there's a gap, right, that we could be plugging. And we know that our health system needs, especially if we're going to roll out a national health insurance, we need that money. And the reality is that, I'll repeat it again, is that a wealth tax also plays a redistributive role in terms of redistribution of resources in the economy and also to equalize the society. So it has a role to play in protecting our democracy and to protecting our kind of social compact, because when you have a situation of the super wealthy, then determining policy, determining how the system, how our tax system runs, it can then undermine and result in higher levels of inequality, poverty, and unemployment, which is what we've been seeing over the last little while. And so we really need to make progress in decreasing inequality in South Africa if we want to tackle gender-based violence, for example, if we want to tackle unemployment. And so a wealth tax is necessary because it doesn't make sense to have the numbers that we have of people with the billions and billions that they can't really use. Whereas, the people, unhoused people down the road in my neighborhood could use a good government program that provides publicly provided housing for them.
But
So
how
it's
is this
also
a
about giving
function
back to
of
public.
the wealth tax? Maybe why don't you just increase maybe corporate income tax instead of the wealth tax? I'm just playing a devil's advocate.
So that would be a possibility, but the reality is the nature of the financialized nature of our economies and the way in which CEOs and so forth are paid is that many of them are paid in assets. So, in shares and so forth. So they're not wealthy on income alone. This is what's often missed. And so this is why we have to talk about the super rich. So people don't feel, that I don't feel like you're trying to come for my my rands and cents as a middle-class South African. We're talking about multi-millionaires to billionaires who have assets in shares and pensions and so forth, in paintings, in bottles of wine, So it gets crazy. But the important thing here is that those resources are sitting there untapped, and it's unjust, and it results in a highly unequal society, and one in which we should be redistributing resources and a tax mix that's just.
Lance, the idea that much of the wealth gets hidden in assets, and so the wealthy, because they know that they're going to pay about 40% maybe on their income when it's in a certain category, then they start getting remunerated, through assets, houses and paintings, maybe even jewelry. I don't know. What do you have to say to that about that particular wealth which is hidden in assets? It should be taxed. That's the point of the wealth tax.
Certainly, it certainly should be taxed, and to a large extent, it is taxed because the most likely asset that these people are given would be shares in the company, and there is complex tax legislation. It is complex, but it's very effective in taxing the value of that asset at the 40% or 45%. And we should then also remember that that's not the end of it, because when dividends are paid on those shares, then there is a dividend tax of 20%. Now, the another important issue was touched on there, which just demonstrates some of the problems with the wealth tax, and it was mentioned that these people have their wealth in pensions. Now, I think it's important to appreciate that the money that sits in retirement funds in this country go a long way to funding the country. I mean, the national treasury, when they issue bonds, that's where the money comes from. So a wealth tax on the value of a pension fund or a retirement fund is really just you're taking the same money that you generally already have access to. Just so practically, I don't really think that achieves much. And a lot of the wealth will sit in a retirement fund or pension fund, and this is one of the sort of major arguments against the wealth tax. But again, I'm not against a wealth tax. I mean, I think redistribution is necessary, but it has to be fair on everyone. And in my view, the current tax system is already far too easy, in the sense that those who are formally employed and who are in the sort of formal economy really can't are forced to pay their taxes, and should we simply just be relying on them to keep compliant and not really worrying about those who aren't compliant, who operate outside of the formal system. And I think that's what SARS is addressing, and the Commissioner is certainly trying to address very effectively.
What do you say? I mean, the idea, I hear you're touching on it, but Thokozile believes strongly that at the center of this wealth tax is a sort of question of addressing inequality. What's your reaction to that? Would the wealth tax address inequality?
Well, I guess, and again, I think that is, look, in my view, it is a leap of faith to say we're going to collect more, and that will address inequality. Addressing inequality doesn't start with collecting more taxes. In my view, it starts with adequate policy that is funded by tax. So we can sit back and ask ourselves, well, where's the policy? And what are we going to do with this wealth tax? Because if it's simply to give a grant to someone then, with all due respect, I don't think that is really what you should be looking to achieve from a wealth tax. Yeah.
This is Power Talk, Bantwana Benkosi. If you've just joined us, we are having a conversation around the possibility, necessity, and the inner workings of a wealth tax. 0861987000. It's our studio line if you'd like to make a contribution. I'm going to take calls, and I want to come back to the 2025 budget speech that is expected to take place next week. I think they're dubbing it 3.0 with regards to the question of wealth tax. If the minister were to deal with it on the one hand, what would be the expectation in relation to this immediate budget, but also some of the concrete proposals you guys have to deal with unemployment, inequality, and poverty? What should the budget do to help us resolve these problems? Thabo in Mamelodi, welcome to Power Talk.
The good doctor, morning.
Good morning.
I think your guest there is coming with the good point, because often, if you can look at it, even the 3.0 budget that is coming, just go and look at the big chunk of that budget is going into giving business to these wealthy people. Every single year, these people are doing business with the state, and of which they are responsible for the demise of most of the SMMEs. If you can get the stats, SMMEs are losing business with the state every year. Last year alone, about 18,000 SMMEs. That even the president and the minister are saying the people that are responsible for creating jobs are the SMMEs, but the SMMEs, are just falling apart, and then most of the chunk of the money is given to these wealthy people.
In what way? I'm not sure if I follow. The chunk of the money that government is going to budget, in what way is it going to the wealthy?
Yes, they are giving most of the jobs to this private sector. They are the ones who are taking most of the jobs that are responsible, that were supposed to be given to SMMEs, that is supposed to create jobs. And then end of the day, they don't even create jobs. So I think they should be taxed more. That's my point.
Okay, Thabo. I don't know if all these companies that are called tenderpreneurs, those are SMMEs, no? I don't know. But Lance, I'll start with you. What do you think the minister should do differently in 3.0 to sort of redirect or give us a different direction in terms of our economic experience in South Africa? I'm thinking here, unemployment, and also could the budget be used to drive investment in labor-intensive industries? What expectations are reasonable for a different direction with the next budget?
Yes, thank you for that very easy question to answer. I think, whenever the minister is up, stands up there, I think to myself, gosh, I wouldn't like to be in that position. I think, look, I'm a tax person, technical tax person, and the one thing, since over the last 10, 15 years is there's been very little effective tax policy tools that have come in to address or to boost the economy, let's so to speak. And I'd like to see that there is at least an undertaking, or that tax policy tools will be looked at to create employment. There've been one or two, but in my view, far too little. And then the one area I feel quite strongly about, and particularly given what's happened globally since Donald Trump has come into power, is how we tax the digital economy. And we're talking here big tech. We're talking, Google, Alphabet, Meta, Apple, etc., who pay in effective 4% or 5% in taxes on their hundreds of billions of dollars in profits. And they have strung the OECD along for too long, and we have simply also been strung along by the OECD, meaning that, nothing has changed.
Yeah.
And the rules of how we tax these foreign companies, which were put together 100 plus years ago, are not applicable. And we are losing out on revenue that we're talking about trade surpluses or deficits and tariffs. I mean, we're not talking about how much we pay to these big tech companies. And why aren't we taxing why aren't they paying their fair share of taxes? I think we're seeing some court challenges, where because it also it also hurts the media, print media, where people have access to these platforms like X, Instagram, and and at no cost are able to spread what is sometimes deliberate misinformation. And where's the compensation to society for that damage?
Have you ever maybe made an estimation of how much revenue could be collected from the tech giants? I mean, just taking those ones, streaming platforms, social media, delivery services. Are you able to estimate how much could be collected here in South Africa? Just an estimation.
I can't. The numbers are not really available, but I'm pretty sure. I mean, if we think about how much do we pay Apple, Google, these every year from South Africa, I'm pretty sure it will be more than what we are wanting to collect on, an additional 0.5%.
Is there an example in the world that South Africa could borrow from in terms of new tax rules regarding these multinational high-tech companies?
Yes, in Africa, indeed, Kenya and Nigeria have simply, gone and imposed the digital tax. We've unfortunately, for whatever reason, been strung along by the OECD. We said because the OECD is bringing in these very complex measures, and they're saying then you'll collect, hundreds of billions of rands in taxes, but at what point? So Kenya, Nigeria, in Africa in particular.
Yeah.
And I think India has also implemented. So there are certainly examples of how this can look and work.
Yeah. Okay. Thokozile, wouldn't that be a concrete way forward? I mean, those are the real rich people. Top 10 rich companies, tech companies occupy at least 60%, if not 70%. And they are alive in the everyday experience of South Africans.
Absolutely, I agree. And I think that's why we need to have, we have the Tax Davis Committee, and I think we need to have a revamp of that. I hate to suggest another committee, but I think it's important for us to, especially given the national interest now in tax, because the value-added tax debate has really garnered a lot of interest in tax broadly. And so I think it's time that we have another conversation about the tax policy that the country is pursuing, because it has political and economic ramifications. And, you talked about Budget 3.0, for example. So just looking at 2025.
Yeah.
And the gap that, Treasury is needing to fill is about 2.7 billion. And the research for 2025, right? 2025, 2026. And the research that we did on just taxing the top 1% of South African adults, their assets, could raise between 70 billion and 160 billion.
This is with the wealth tax?
This is with a wealth tax. So this
at what percentage?
So this is at about between 0.01%
I see. You did mention
to
that,
1%. Yeah. So it's even when we think about taking tax evasion into account, people leaving, we would still be looking at about 134 billion. So it is an important tool in our toolbox. And I think, taxing corporate income tax, taxing and the other thing is that South Africa, as the lead of the G20 host of the G20 this year, we need to push very hard the global agreements around tax and tax evasion, illicit financial flows, and so forth, because we need to make sure that we get, especially the big companies, at source, and so that they can't go from one country to another trying to avoid tax evasion. And so there's moves to have a global tax of around 15% for corporate income tax, for example. And so there's different proposals on the table that all countries can agree to, so that no matter where you're based, you have to pay your fair share of taxes. And then you were saying, what would I want to spend it on? Like, what would I want to see in Budget 3.0? And we've been arguing that we need to move away from fiscal consolidation, which is budget cuts, into an investment stimulus style budget in which we increase government spending in the economy, in particular in the care economy and infrastructure. So care economy, we're talking about education, health, public infrastructure such as public transport and so forth, because that stimulates growth. And research that we've taken just said just a 1% increase of GDP spending for 5 years could increase GDP growth by 6.9% and employment by 8.8%. And we've just had a downgrade of our growth forecast from the IMF. So we need to change what we're doing. We can't continue designing our budget with this fantasy that somehow growth is going to happen if we cut government spending. We need to do the opposite under Keynesian thinking, which is to really stimulate the economy and get jobs going, get people building, get people filling potholes. We don't have a lack of need for jobs, and we don't have a lack of people available to do those jobs. It's just the political will to design a budget that will deliver on that.
Okay. Thanks very much, Lance Kolop, Chartered Tax Advisor for Kolop Tax Collective, Thokozile Madonko, the Political Economist and Researcher at the Southern Center for Inequality at Wits University. Thank you to you both for creating time to speak to the budget, and all the best.